Hello to our friends joining us via recording. We are going to work through the stuff from week number 5 in lab. So we have a little bit of tissue stuff to cover, and then we're going to focus most of our time on the skin. So when we talk about the types of tissue that we have left to do in lab this week, it is muscle tissue and nervous tissue. So we are looking at our first kind of muscle tissue here. I'm not sure if my friends here in the chat happen to have a chance to look ahead. Do we have any idea what kind of tissue we're looking at in this slide? I don't know if we had a chance to look or not. Yeah, that's cool. Miriam says she hasn't had a chance yet. We've been focusing on that exam, right? Good guess, Nicole. It isn't smooth muscle, but it does have a similar shape to smooth muscle. This particular type of muscle tissue, see how we have these dark and light lines in this type of tissue? And I can see all these alternating dark and light lines in this kind of tissue. This kind of tissue that I'm looking at right here is skeletal muscle tissue. So I'll type it for us here. This one is skeletal muscle tissue. The dark and light lines that you see on this type of tissue, we have a name for those, and we're going to talk a lot about them in lab when we get to muscle tissue. Those are called striations. Striations. So you'll probably see a note in the guided lesson or maybe in your packet that talks about types of muscle tissue being striated. Think about striated, meaning that there's stripes. So this type of muscle tissue, skeletal muscle tissue, one of the first ways you're going to identify it is you're going to see these stripes, these dark and then light, dark and then light. So we see this pattern where it's dark and light on these cells. The other thing about skeletal muscle tissue that we can kind of see on this slide, and I'll show you another one to show it what it looks like. Skeletal muscle tissue cells are really long and skinny. So I've got a cell up here, and then right below it I've got another long cell, and I've got another one right here. As we're going to talk about in our muscle lab, our skeletal muscle cells are completely filled with big long protein tubes, and those protein tubes have these stripes like we see here. So each cell in skeletal muscle tissue is really long and skinny, and it's got protein tubes in it. Those protein tubes are going to do contraction. So long and skinny cells that have stripes, that's skeletal muscle tissue. Here's one way that skeletal muscle tissue looks. The other way that skeletal muscle tissue looks is what we see like this. And these are much prettier versions of skeletal muscle tissue. But if we were in lab together, most of us wouldn't have this slide. Most of us would have the slide that we just looked at. So most of us, when we looked at skeletal muscle tissue, this is what we'd see. It's kind of ugly, but you can really see those stripes. You can really see those striations. Like 3 of us would have been lucky, and our slide would have looked like this. So this is skeletal muscle tissue when I make those cells separated from one another. So here's one cell that's completely separated or not touching. Here's another cell that's completely separated and not touching. You can see over here I've got one cell in this tube, and then there's another cell here, and then there's some that aren't in focus. When we talk about skeletal muscle tissue, remember I told you it's long and skinny cells. So these cells that are really long and skinny, and again you can see those dark and light stripes that are in there because we said it was a striated tissue. But the other thing, yeah, so Miriam beat me to it. The other thing we see with skeletal muscle tissue are these little dots. These little dots are nuclei, but there's this special thing about skeletal muscle tissue, and it's actually one of the ways that you recognize skeletal muscle tissue. It's called multinucleate. Typing that word for you, multinucleate. What that means is multiple nuclei. So the thing with skeletal muscle tissue is they've got more than one nucleus in them. So this is one really big, long cell. And each of these little things, I like to call them the ants on a log, right? Each of these little ants on the log, these little dark spots, those are all nuclei. This big, long muscle cell has more than one of them. So when we look at this version of our skeletal muscle tissue slide, you can see all of those nuclei This type of muscle tissue is multinucleate. It has more than one nucleus in it. So when we look at skeletal muscle tissue, the things that we would see, first thing we see, long and skinny cells. That's the first thing we see. Second thing we see are the striations. And the third thing that we see are these multiple nuclei, these dark spots. That's how we're going to recognize skeletal muscle tissue. Yeah, to the question in the chat, friends are totally right. We had a few pieces of, or a few types of tissue from lesson number 4 that we had to wrap up this week. So right now we're doing the last 4 types of tissues from histology, lab packet number 4, and then we're going to dive into number 5. So if you already did this, you're in good shape. If you already know your muscle tissues, you're set. Hannah has a question. Go for it.
Could you respell that one word you said about the stripe word that you said about the cell?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, here, I'll add that to up there by multinucleate. They're called striations. Striations, that's the name for the stripes. Or when we talk about the tissue, we call it striated muscle tissue. So 2 ways to say the same thing. Either it has striations, it has stripes, or we'd say that it's striated muscle tissue. It's tissue, again, with the striations, with the stripes. So yeah, with our skeletal muscle tissue, here's some of the big words: multinucleate, more than one nucleus, and striations, the stripes. Nicole asked if the stripes are going up and down. Yeah, we could kind of consider it that way. When we look at it, so if I see my cell that in this arrangement, this particular cell, see how it's going kind of from the top to the bottom, and then the stripes kind of go this opposite direction. It's actually the same thing when I back up, so we're going to lose our words here, but I'm going to back up to the other tissue. My cells are going this direction. They're long and skinny, and then those stripes kind of go up and down like this. The direction of the stripes doesn't matter as much as just the fact that they have so many of them. So you could kind of think about it as either going up and down or going sideways. They don't go the same way that the cell goes. So the whole cell is going this direction, and then those stripes go the opposite direction. And we're going to talk about in Unit 3 what makes those stripes happen. We have some places that have a bunch of proteins and some places that don't have as many proteins. That's why you get the stripes, because the dark part has a bunch of proteins, the light part doesn't have as many. So we alternate back and forth with dark and light. Yeah, so Nicole asked if this is the only type of striated tissue. Actually, I have one other type of muscle tissue that is also striated, and I pulled a couple of pictures of that one. My other type of striated muscle tissue is cardiac muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle tissue. So let's get our word back here. We would say that cardiac muscle tissue is striated, or I'll put underneath it, it has striations, whatever way we want to learn that. Cardiac muscle tissue. See how I've got those dark and white lines again? So dark and light lines again. With cardiac muscle tissue, first thing we look for, remember, is those striations. It's got those alternating patterns. But then the second thing you look for with cardiac muscle tissue, see how I can see some spaces like over here where there's this little jagged line right here. I've got another jagged line right here, another jagged line here. Those dark lines that I'm seeing are things that I call intercalated discs. Intercalated discs. So let me circle some of them for you to show you. Intercalated discs are places where my cardiac muscle cells attach to each other. So cardiac muscle cells are much smaller than skeletal muscle cells. Remember when we looked at skeletal muscle cells that it was kind of the entire length of our field of view was one cell. When you look in here, I've got a ton of different cells. So over here on the side, one cell up here, one cell right here, one cell here. We've got all kinds of these little short cells that are attached to each other. These cells, if we were to look at them up close, sometimes they'll look kind of like the letter V, or occasionally they even kind of look like the letter Y. where they would be attached to other muscle cells at each of these little junctions. So I'm drawing you some pretty terrible art over here. But imagine that this is one cell kind of shaped like the letter Y, and it's attached to another cell down here at the bottom. And this cell is attached to somebody here and down here. Skeletal muscle tissue, we call it branched. Branched, meaning it's not long and skinny like we saw with the skeletal muscle tissue. Those cells are branched. They're kind of shaped like the letter Y, or at least they're just not long tubes. So they're still striated like skeletal muscle tissue, but they're not long and skinny like skeletal muscle tissue. They're short and they're branching. And again, these intercalated discs, these dark lines, I can see another one up here, that connects these cells together. That's what I see when I look at cardiac muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle tissue, each cell only has one nucleus, by the way. So skeletal muscle tissue, we said, was multinucleate. When we talk about cardiac muscle tissue, there's just one nucleus. So there's one muscle cell here, and it's attached to another muscle cell here. This is its own cell. Each of these nuclei show us a different cell, which is how we know that the cells in this type of tissue are much smaller, because we have so many different nuclei. So only one nucleus and intercalated discs and these striations, that's cardiac muscle tissue. Here's the other version of cardiac muscle tissue that you'll see. And I really like this one because look at how dark these intercalated discs are here. So you can really see, I'll put that word up again for us. You can really see those things called intercalated discs. Intercalated discs are the places where my muscle cells attach to each other. So intercalated discs, these dark lines that I see attaching things. Let me see if it'll let me zoom in. If I zoom in really close, see how I kind of zoomed in here? It's harder to see, but see how you can see that alternating light and dark pattern when we zoom in really close. So I've got the light and dark pattern, those things called striations, and then I've got those really dark intercalated discs. So dark and light patterns for striations, and then my dark intercalated discs that are in between them. Yeah, so Jacqueline mentioned that her challenge she's having with our types of tissue is learning the different appearances of them. Yeah, that's something that's probably just going to come with practice. Like, we hate it that's the way that we have to study with the tissues is looking at the different types or the different appearances of them. I tried to highlight in our video today the two most common ones for our types of muscle tissue. So definitely reference back to this video too when you're studying to get the big picture ideas of what these types of tissue look like. And then you can practice with that slideshow that has muscle tissue, trying to sort them between. So that's why I'm trying to give you some big picture pointers. How do we recognize the tissues? Intercalated discs are the big one for cardiac muscle tissue. So look, if you see stripes and you see intercalated discs, cardiac muscle tissue. If you see stripes and the cells are long and skinny, skeletal muscle tissue. So try to find some big picture ways that we could distinguish between them. I know it's tough because there's more than one way that these slides look, but we have to practice with seeing the different kinds. Nicole asked, will we be able to zoom in on the lab test? I'm not sure if we can or not. I know the stripes are hard to see when we're at this magnification, but the big thing that would tell you this is cardiac muscle, even if we couldn't see those stripes, was these intercalated discs. 100% we can see those. The only type of muscle tissue with those really dark intercalated discs is cardiac muscle. So even if you can't zoom in on the exam, because I'm not sure if you can or not, if you can't zoom in on the exam, if you see these intercalated discs, you know it's cardiac muscle. So there's a study tip for you. The other thing I'll mention too is with our cardiac muscle tissue. I know it's a little bit bleached out right here, but this area right here, and we have a little bit more up here, These spaces on cardiac muscle tissue slides are actually filled with adipose. So if you see tissue that has open spaces in between those muscle cells, that would be places where we actually have adipose tissue that's in with it. I think we probably know this because we need to know it for the lecture exam. What's the function of adipose tissue, or especially white adipose, white adipocytes? What do those things do for us? Okay, one of their functions was acting like a fin. Yep. Yeah, the reason we see them here in the heart is to act as an energy reserve. So the adipose tissue that you find in between our cardiac muscle cells here, they store energy for the heart. Our heart is constantly beating, right? And so we constantly need energy there. We'll actually store some adipose tissue mixed in with our cardiac tissue. So this slide doesn't show it super well, but some of the other slides that you're looking at will show the same kind of shape of cells. You'll still see those intercalated discs, but you might see that adipose tissue mixed in with it. The only type of muscle tissue that has adipose tissue mixed in with it is our cardiac muscle tissue. I'm going to go back here. I don't think, yeah, so we don't really have adipose tissue on this cardiac muscle tissue slide. But again, you can see those stripes really well, and you can see those intercalated discs where those cells connect to each other. Because here, let's go back. The pretty skeletal muscle tissue, let's go to the ugly one. Notice when I look at this, how these cells are really long. There's none of the chopped up intercalated discs. Really long cells. They're kind of falling apart. We can see some places where they fall apart, but there's not the branching pattern. You don't see really large nuclei. This one was our skeletal muscle tissue. So you can definitely see the stripes on skeletal muscle tissue, but we don't see intercalated discs. That's how I would tell the difference between the two of them. So skeletal tissue, the ugly version, but it has really good stripes. It's striated. Skeletal muscle tissue, the pretty version, that we can see those stripes. We can see the nuclei, because remember, it's multinucleate, and you see those long, skinny cells. And then we get to our much more messy cardiac muscle tissue with the intercalated discs that attach the cells there, and still those stripes, really big nuclei, or are ones where we can see those intercalated discs really clearly. So those are our two types of striated muscle tissue. The other type of muscle tissue that we have is called smooth muscle tissue. Smooth muscle tissue. And smooth muscle tissue gets its name because it does not have striations. Striations, or those stripes. When we have muscle tissue that doesn't have stripes, we call it smooth muscle tissue. So I'm going to put here no striations. No striations. First way we'll identify it is knowing it has no striations. The second way that we'll identify it is see how these nuclei are kind of squished looking. They're kind of long and skinny, and they're kind of sometimes wavy. If we were able to look up super close, which I don't think I have any pictures in our slide of it because we can't go this close with our microscopes. If we could look all the way up close at smooth muscle cells, the shape of those cells are going to look like this. They're going to be what we call spindle-shaped. Spindle-shaped. Now, I don't pretend that I do any sewing at all, but apparently if you did sewing and you're working with spindles, they're really wide in the middle, and then they're kind of pointy at the two ends. So when you look at smooth muscle tissue, the shape of the cells is you've got a really big middle part where the nucleus is, and then the edges are going to be much more squished or much more squeezed together. So you look at smooth muscle tissue and you see these large nuclei, and then you probably can't see much of anything else. I mean, we can kind of see a little bit of a wavy pattern from where it's squeezed together, but what we definitely don't see is alternating light and dark, light and dark. We don't see those striations. So When we look at smooth muscle tissue, your big tip-off is we're looking for these big nuclei that we see inside here, and we don't have those stripes. That's how we tell the difference between them. Hey, I need you to make a note for yourself, and it says this in your guided lesson, but I need to make sure that we actually do this. Compare smooth muscle to dense, regular, connective tissue. Should have pulled a picture in, I apologize. Dense, regular connective tissue looks a lot like smooth muscle. We need to be able to distinguish between those two because I guarantee there's going to be questions on the homework assignment and probably on the exam that asks us to tell the difference. Biggest way you can tell a difference, smooth muscle has more large nuclei. Smooth muscle has a lot of large nuclei. So what I mean by that is when you look at this tissue, see all of these purple spots? All of these purple spots are nuclei, and I've got a lot of them on my tissue in my field of view here. When you look at dense, regular connective tissue, you're not going to see as many nuclei, and they're going to be squeezed really flat. They'll be really dark, and they'll be squeezed really flat, so you won't really see them. But when I'm talking about smooth muscle tissue, you see these large nuclei, and there's a whole lot of them. So smooth muscle tissue, no striations, and those large nuclei that we see in there. Okay, perfect. Yes, so Nicole says that dense, regular connective tissue is on page 20 of that online guided lesson. So if you wanted to pull that up, to put it side by side with the smooth muscle, that would be a great way for you to practice, to put it there to see those two. I might have, let me check and see, I think I put in another image of this. Yeah, so one more image to show you. And I know this is pretty ugly, and in all honesty, smooth muscle tissue is pretty ugly. But this is smooth muscle tissue out here where in this area. The way I know it's smooth muscle tissue is see these really large flat nuclei. I've got one here and here. We've got these large flat nuclei that are out here in an area that's kind of wavy. So this is an ugly smooth muscle tissue. I probably wouldn't use this particular picture on the homework assignment or on the exam, but just be aware the best way for you to identify smooth muscle tissue is to look for these large nuclei. They're not all flat and super skinny. They're a little bit taller, but they're in this elongated pattern in the middle of my smooth muscle cells. How do we feel about our 3 types of muscle tissue? Give me a thumbs up or let me know what questions we have about these muscle tissues. Yeah, Jacqueline says she's definitely got to study it. 100% always the way it is in anatomy, right? Unfortunately. Nicole says she's going to redo all of lesson number 4. That's a great way to remind yourself of what all the tissues look like. So that's not a bad idea. I'll mention too, sorry, I got to stop eating that toast, right? I'll mention too that you can do a search in Google Images. Do a search, so when you're at Google, you can change Google to be an images search, and you can search for each of the types of tissue in the body. That's another really good way to study this stuff. So if you do a search for smooth muscle tissue, it'll pull up a bunch of different pictures of smooth muscle tissue. Do a search for cardiac muscle tissue. It'll pull up a whole bunch of different examples. So I know we were talking about in the chat earlier, like there's a lot of different ways it looks. The more different ways that it looks that you start to recognize it, the better off you're going to be. So another way to enhance your study time is to try Google Images. If we were in the classroom, 100%, I promise you, I would be pulling up Google Images in class too. So I do love me some Google Images. It gives you lots of different views of what you're studying. So give that a try with these tissue types as well. The other type of tissue, last type of tissue that we're learning this semester is nervous tissue. The good news with nervous tissue is all of our nervous tissue slides are going to look about the same. So that's helpful. When we look at nervous tissue, you're always going to see this kind of pink background that we see on the slide, and then you're going to see blue cells. We are going to do a lot of practice in unit number 3 with drawing neurons, which was easier for me when I was drawing on a whiteboard in the class than when I'm trying to draw here in our blackboard area. But when you talk about neurons, let's see if I can do it here for us. When we talk about neurons, they have a really funky shape, and you can kind of see that shape when we're looking at the slides. So neurons have this big area of them that's called their cell body, which is basically where all of their thinking and processing, that kind of stuff happens. And then they have these long extensions called their axon, where they send information out of. So when you're looking at the slide here, the cell body part is what's going to stain the dark blue color. And then look at this one, for example. See how I've got an extension that goes down and out? That would be the axon on my neuron. Or I'm looking down here at this one, the dark blue cell body, and then I've got an extension coming out. That might be my axon. But you also see these little branches that I drew up here. These are called dendrites to help it receive information. So the big idea being with neurons, you're going to see these really dark blue, funky looking cells. They've got this funky looking appearance to help them send and receive messages. So the big cells that you see when you're looking at nervous tissue are a type of cells called neurons. Neurons are the thinking cells of nervous tissue. So the really big ones, these are called neurons. But if you look on here, you can also see, especially on this particular slide, see all these little dark blue spots. These little dark blue spots that you're seeing here, their names, they're called neuroglia. Neuroglia. And neuroglia are helper cells. So again, we'll talk more about this in unit number 3, but neuroglia are not thinker cells. Neuroglia are just the kind of cells that help to keep my neurons alive, or help to make sure they have the right shape, help to make sure that the concentration of ions are good inside and outside, all those kind of helping functions. That's what neuroglia do. And so those neuroglia are much smaller. It's those little blue dots that you see down there. The really big ones are the neurons. So the large neurons and the really small neuroglia. I'm going to nerd out on you a little bit here and pull up you zoom in close on it and see. You can see again those dark neurons that I see here. This one's a little bit more bright blue. But here I want to point out this little section right here. I'm going to draw a little circle around it. That little section in there, the light spot is the nucleus. And in the very middle of the nucleus, we have a thing, I'm pretty sure we learned about it, the nucleolus. Nucleolus. If you remember way back from organelles, we talked about the nucleolus that was inside the nucleus. That was a part of the cell that makes ribosomes. So when you look at neurons, not only can you see the light spot area, that's their nucleus, but you can also see the little nucleolus in the middle. I feel like it kind of looks like an eye on a squid. So we've got these neurons that have a squid eye. So here, let me delete my words so we can see them again. Got its little squid eye right over here. And we got our little squid eye over here as well. So neurons, the dark blue funky shaped stuff, you can see their nucleolus in the very middle. And then especially on this picture, see all of these little blue dots here? All of those are the neuroglia. All of those are the helper cells that help this kind of tissue to function. So neurons and neuroglia, when you're seeing your tissue location and function guide, it does list different functions for those types of cells. So make sure we know that the neurons are the thinker cells, and make sure we know that the neuroglia are the helper cells. How do we feel about nervous tissue? Thumbs up, or what questions do we have? Yes, the easiest, right? There's only one way that it looks. That's very true. And there was a note, I'll type it here on the side too, in the guided lesson, says to compare this to fibrocartilage connective tissue. Compare it to fibrocartilage connective tissue. Now, to be fair, it's not like they look super similar, but let's see if anyone happens to remember. I know we're like hopped up on lecture, so we might not remember. Does anyone remember what colors we saw on fibrocartilage connective tissue? Any ideas? Yeah, blue. Yeah, so it's blue and it's pink. The reason that we told you to compare nervous tissue to fibrocartilage is just to be aware that with fibrocartilage, let's see if I can do a little sketch for you here. With fibrocartilage, we had a bunch of blue fibers, and the cells were squished in the middle, and they were kind of pink or purple. So the reason we told you to compare these two types of tissue, nervous tissue and fibrocartilage, is because these are my two types of tissue that have these blue and pink colors in them, or even kind of purple blue, pink, whatever you want to call it. The color scheme is the same. So it's not nearly as hard to tell the difference between fibrocartilage and nervous tissue as it is to compare, for example, smooth muscle to dense connective tissue. But it might not hurt just to see those side by side to make sure we recognize, hey, these are two that I can use the color to identify. Just make sure you don't mix them up. So last note there with those tissue comparisons. If I remember correctly, on this week's homework assignment, we actually mix in a lot of the tissues from last week too. So it's not just going to be muscle tissue and nervous tissue that we're asking you questions about. We are going to do some questions that pull in those connective tissues or those epithelial tissues from last week. So be aware as you're working on the homework assignment for week number 5, you are going to have some review. I promise that's on purpose, because remember that lab exam is coming up in 2 weeks. So want to try to give you a little bit of review on track with that. Here we'll tie in so now we'll actually move into lesson number 5. We'll start lesson number 5 by looking at more tissues. Gotta love tissues. Actually, not really. A lot of us, when we're in person, hate those microscopes, but they come out all the time. Yay, no. Yeah, I feel you, Jacqueline. So here's the good news. As we start talking about the skin, the stuff that we're doing here with the skin related to the microscope is going to help us study our types of tissue. Help me out in the chat. Let's see if we remember. Do we remember any of the types of tissue that I find in different places of the skin? Any ideas about some of the kinds of tissue that we're seeing here? A tip off for you, by the way, is the skin has things like the epidermis and the dermis and the hypodermis. Yeah, so the epidermis is part of the skin. And then we've got 2 parts of the dermis. Yeah, so we're remembering some of them. So let me help you start with labeling the skin. So I'm going to do some little sketches over here. You probably can see these little brackets better than I could, so I'm going to add those brackets on there. When we talk about the skin, the outermost layer of the skin is called the epidermis. The epidermis, the beginning part epi, I think we've talked about before, means above. So the epidermis is the outermost layer of your skin. This is what you see when you look in the mirror. This is your skin, the epidermis, the outermost layer. Right underneath the epidermis, we have this big part of the skin. There are 2 parts, but the big part of the skin right underneath the epidermis is called the dermis itself. Because it's so big, it's got 2 parts. So the first part is called the papillary layer of the dermis. The papillary layer of the dermis gets its name because it's got these up and down wavy patterns here. These up and down wavy patterns that you see are called the dermal papillae. So I'm going to add that word for you, dermal papillae. And I promise we'll talk more about this in lecture, lesson number 7 about the skin. But the dermal papillae, these little fingers, they're regions where this part of the dermis reaches up and interacts with the epidermis. Underneath the papillary layer of the dermis, where we wave up and down, we have a much larger layer down here. And this larger layer down here is called the reticular layer. Spelled that wrong, sorry. Of the dermis. The reticular layer of the dermis. And the reticular layer is much bigger, takes up a lot of space down here. This is the image that you have in your worksheet. But what I'll tell you is on the homework assignment and on the exam, we're going to use some of those images of the skin that weren't just from the worksheet. So what I've done over here is I've pulled one of the pictures that you have in the PowerPoint called Tissue Images from Slides. This is the one for the skin. So again, we can still see our regions of the skin. My outermost region is all this dark stuff on the outside. So all of this is the epidermis. And underneath it, so it kind of starts, see how we got kind of those fingers up? This area here is that papillary layer of the dermis. And remember, I told you guys that the reticular layer of the dermis is really big. So all of this space down here, all of this is the reticular layer. And then where we go up and down, I'm going to do a little bit of tracing to give you the general idea. This middle section that I see in here is that papillary layer, and then we have the epidermis on the outside. We've started to fill in a little bit in the chat the types of tissues in these places. So let's fill in those tissues, and I see your question, Miriam. Let's try to do tissue types really fast, and then I'll get your question if that's cool. Epidermis, somebody already told me, is one of those types of tissues with a really long name. Keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. Keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. Somebody put in the chat for me that we've got areolar loose connective tissue in the skin. Do we happen to know where that areolar loose connective tissue is? Do we know which part of the dermis it's in? The papillary or the reticular? Any guesses? We're nervous. Yeah, so we might have referenced our document, or we just gave it a guess. It is in the papillary layer. So the papillary layer of the dermis has areolar loose connective tissue. Areolar loose connective tissue. The reticular layer of the dermis has dense, irregular connective tissue. Dense, irregular connective tissue. Yeah, we're frantically looking it up, right? Yep, no shame in that. We're still learning our locations. Here's the thing. When you remember, we have to, for each of our types of tissue in the body, we have to know their appearance, have to identify them, and then we also have to know where they're found and what they do. Best where they're found to learn for these 3 types of tissue that we have listed here are their locations in the skin. So, well, the only place that we have keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium is in the epidermis. That's the only location. We have areolar loose connective tissue in a few different locations, but the best one for you to learn is the papillary layer of the dermis. And I say that because this location comes up in 2 of our different lab packets. So we have to know that areolar loose connective tissue, we need to know its location for lesson number 4, which is all about tissues. But we also have to know in lesson number 5 which kind of tissue is found in this location in the body. So I'm just saying we're double dipping here, right? The papillary layer of the dermis comes up in lesson number 4 and lesson number 5. So let's learn that that's the location of areolar loose connective tissue. If you learn that, you're set. Same deal with the reticular layer of the dermis. That's the location of dense, irregular connective tissue, one of those locations of it. Again, it showed up in lesson 5 and it showed up in lesson 4. So let's learn this as our location of dense, irregular connective tissue. So save some mind space there. Learn these 3 tissues, learn their location in the skin as the location you're memorizing. Remember, by the way, that dense, irregular connective tissue is really messy. I can see all these really messy proteins down here. I can see the really messy proteins over here. Areolar connective tissue is not dense. It's a loose connective tissue. So notice how up top, close to the epidermis here, it's a lot lighter up there. Or same deal, I can see it's a lot more light up here. There's not as many proteins in areolar loose connective tissue. So it's going to be a little bit lighter in appearance than that dense, irregular stuff down below. Miriam, you had a question. Did I answer it or do you still have it?
Yes. No, I just gonna looking at the picture on the left, and I see four different layers of tissues. So I see the top one that's orange that says epidermis, and I see the darker one below that, and I see another one that you pointing at as the second layer. But there's that middle part in here that's a little darker that looks like I think it's like stratified squamous type of tissue.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So all of this, and that's what I don't like about this picture, is all of this stuff down here that's green and all of this orange-red stuff up here, all of that is actually keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. It's just that all of this stuff that I see out here that's orange, these are the cells that are completely keratinized. So these are the cells that are completely filled with keratin. And we talked about, I think it was last week when we did epithelial tissue, how when you're filled with keratin, you die. So all we're seeing in these cells out here is they're completely filled with keratin and they're completely dead. When they made this particular slide of that tissue, that keratin got stained orange. So these are the outermost parts of the keratinized stratified squamous epithelium where there's a bunch of keratin. These are the cells down here that are still alive. They're not filled with keratin yet. The way that they made their slide made those cells look green for whatever reason. That's why I don't like this picture. I like our picture more because all of this pink stuff, all of it's pink. So, well, everything's pink, right? So that's a problem that it's all pink. But this outermost layer is the epidermis, and all of it's the same color. Now, some of it's a little bit darker because these are the cells down here that are still alive. And these are the cells up top that are dead, that are filled with keratin. But all of these cells together are part of the epidermis because everything is stratified squamous. So this orange stuff you see out here is cells that are completely filled with keratin. They're still considered part of the keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. You can just see those cells a little bit more clearly down here before they died and filled up with keratin. Does that make more sense? Okay, perfect. Yeah, I don't like this color scheme. I don't know why they decided to make those cells green versus orange, but that's why it helps to look at our slides. Everything's all the same color. So these are all stratified squamous cells that we see here. Yeah. Now, when we look at the parts of the skin, there is a note in your packet that we not only have the parts we've talked about, so let's list the parts we've talked about. We talked about the epidermis, we talked about the papillary layer, of the dermis. We talked about the reticular layer of the dermis. There's one other layer that we couldn't see on our other slides that we can see on this one, which is why I included it. The last layer that we have in the skin is called the hypodermis. And this hypo part means below. The hypodermis is the part of the skin that is where we find another type of tissue. Can we tell from our picture down here? Because here's my hypodermis. Do we have any idea what kind of tissue we find in the hypodermis down here? Any guesses on what kind of tissue that is? Let's zoom in and see if we can see it better. Yeah, so down here we've got those big circle cells that we can see down here. Those big circle cells, they look empty, but they're actually filled with lipids. The hypodermis is the location of adipose loose connective tissue. Adipose loose connective tissue. I really should have just done CT. We're just going to do CT. Adipose loose connective tissue. So in your lab packet, there's not a picture that shows you the hypodermis having adipose tissue. But if I look, so we'll label it here on this one that we're looking at here. All of this area, everything below the line, this is all the hypodermis, the places that have adipose tissue. And then the big area that we talked about before was the reticular layer of the dermis, the reticular layer. The papillary layer is a lot smaller on this one, but here I'm going to circle a little area for you to see. Papillary layer of the dermis. And this is one where the epidermis is super ugly and it's got those two colors again. So I've got the outermost layer that's completely dead, that's this light color, and then the more living layer that's here in the darker color. All of this portion out here is the epidermis. Now, I'm not going to ask you to label the regions on this slide because it's so ugly, but what I wanted to point out to you is you can see that hypodermis down here. You can see the area where we have adipose loose connective tissue. That's the last one that I'll mention for you to really focus on learning its skin location, because if we know that adipose is found in the hypodermis, we will also know what kind of tissue is in the hypodermis, and that's adipose tissue. So last layer that's deep underneath the epidermis, underneath the two parts of the dermis, is that place called the hypodermis, down underneath it. So the hypodermis, the last layer of the skin. Let's focus on the epidermis right now. So the epidermis is the outermost layer of the skin. In the epidermis, you're going to see in your packet, it talks about the strata. Talks about the strata. Strata is a fancy word for layers. So the epidermis, the outermost layer of the skin, is made of a bunch of different layers or a bunch of different strata. When we talk about them by themselves, we use the singular word stratum. So when we look at skin, you're going to hear things like stratum basal, stratum granulosum. The word stratum is just the singular, or we're talking about one layer. When I talk about strata, that's all the layers together. So when I'm looking at the epidermis, the outermost layer of the skin, there are two kinds of skin that we have on the body. What we see in our picture right now is called thin-skinned. Sorry, I can't let that stand. Here we go. Try again. Thin skin. Thin skin is the kind of skin that covers most of your body. So we're talking everywhere from the surface of your eyelids to anywhere on your face, all over your arms and your legs, thin skin. When we talk about thin skin, it has 4 strata. It has 4 layers inside of it. So I'm going to show you on our slide here where each of those 4 layers are. we're going to start with the outermost layer. So the outermost layer, I'm going to circle it here on one of my pictures. The outermost layer of the skin that I see up here is something called Stratum Corneum. Stratum Corneum. And this corneum word means cornified, or that's a fancy word for saying it's filled with keratin, and those cells are completely dead. So stratum corneum is this outer layer of cells that I see out here, or I see it down here as well. All those cells that are falling off on the keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, those cells are part of a layer called stratum corneum. So outermost layer of the epidermis is called stratum corneum. Underneath stratum corneum is a dark layer, and I'm going to draw a line kind of underneath it on my bottom image right there. So if you look just above that black line that I drew, see how there's kind of a dark purple line that you can see right here? So that dark purple line that's right underneath stratum corneum, that's a layer that's called stratum granulosum. Stratum granulosum. The word granulosum means that I have granules in this layer. So the reason this layer looks purple is because the cells inside here have some little, I'll type that word for you, some little granules in them. Think of them for now kind of like little rocks or just little circles of dark stuff in them. So stratum granulosum is this dark purple layer that I see here. You can also see it on this one here. So notice how there's a dark purple line right here. That dark purple line is the cells in stratum granulosum. Underneath stratum granulosum, so see my cells that are underneath it that are mixed in here, or I'm going to switch to the other picture, those cells that I see right here. Those cells that I see underneath stratum granulosum are in what we call stratum spinosum. Stratum spinosum. So all of these cells mixed in the middle here, all of these guys are stratum spinosum. Here would be a note to write down for yourself about stratum spinosum. This is the layer of the skin where the most living cells are found. So the cells in stratum spinosum, they're alive, and there's a lot of them. We will talk about in lecture how stratum granulosum is the layer where the cells start to die. So that purple layer of the cells, they're starting to die. In stratum spinosum, they're still definitely alive and kicking. In stratum corneum, they're completely dead. Yeah, so we'll point to the letters or the layers. So stratum spinosum are all these cells that you see here that look kind of round and large. That's stratum spinosum. Stratum granulosum is that dark purple line of cells that I see there. So stratum granulosum again right here, the dark purple line of cells that I see here. And then stratum spinosum, these large nuclei that I see in the middle. There's one more layer of cells, and that's the very bottommost layer of cells. So I'm going to trace it. The very bottommost layer of cells, it's a single row of cells. That single row of cells that I see right here, so the ones that are touching my black line here, that one row of cells, that's called stratum basal. Stratum basal. It's one row of cells. These are the cells that are found right next to the papillary layer of the dermis. So see down here how we're definitely not in epithelial tissue anymore. I've only got cells that are spaced out a little bit. All these little guys are cells. This was that place, by the way. Let me get my typer. Areolar loose connective tissue. Right next to all the areolar loose connective tissue that I see inside here are the cells of stratum basal. So stratum basal is one row of cells that's found right next to areolar loose connective tissue, the papillary layer of the dermis. Hey, let me throw out a review word for us here. The cells that live in stratum basal, they're doing mitosis. What happens in mitosis? What is mitosis? Yeah, so mitosis is when we divide up our DNA. It's when we're making new cells. So in stratum basal, I'm going to put a note here, cells doing mitosis. Stratum basal is where your cells actually replicate to make new skin cells. So you're constantly losing skin cells. This stratum corneum stuff out here, these are the dead cells. You can thank stratum corneum for all the dust in your house. So stratum corneum, these dead cells, they're constantly falling off. Stratum basal is the row of cells down here at the bottom that are constantly dividing to replace those cells that are falling off. So stratum basal, one row of cells in the basement at the very bottom. Right on top of stratum basal are these larger stratum granulosum cells, or excuse me, stratum spinosum, apologies. Stratum basal, stratum spinosum, the big layer here. When we get to the dark layer, it's stratum granulosum, and then we've got stratum corneum on the outside. And again, stratum corneum on the outside, stratum granulosum, the purple layer right next to that, lots of spinosum cells, and then a single row of stratum basal at the very bottom. Nicole asked if an escalator would be a good analogy for the cells moving up. Yeah, you could kind of think about it that way. So you start your lifespan, if you are a cell, here's a word that you'll use in the lab packet. The cells in the epidermis are called keratinocytes. Keratinocytes meaning I'm a cell that's filled with keratin. So down here at stratum basal, my keratinocyte gets on the escalator and then it goes up to stratum spinosum because somebody grows underneath it, pushes it up. When it's in stratum spinosum, somebody else pushes it up to stratum granulosum, and then somebody else is going to push it all the way up into stratum corneum until it falls off. So yeah, I kind of like that, thinking about kind of like an escalator. It starts in stratum basal and gets pushed its way up and out. Okay, what we were looking at just now, we looked at two pictures of thin skin. Thin skin, I'll put a note for us, covers most of the body. Thin skin covers most of the body, but it doesn't cover all of the body. So we're going to look here in a moment at thick skin. Thick skin, because it's thick, is actually going to have an extra stratum in it. So when you're learning your strata, there is one particular stratum that I do not have in thin skin that I have in thick skin. So I'm going to flip over now to thick skin, and we're going to talk about that extra layer. We are looking at now, type it for us, thick skin. So thick skin is a lot thicker than thin skin. Imagine that, right? So all of this that I see here on my image, all of this is the epidermis layer, so lots of keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. Thick skin is really only found in a couple of places. One of those places is the palms of your hands. The other place is the soles of your feet. Basically, places where we have a lot of abrasion, where there's a lot of rubbing. So your hands rub together, or you pick stuff up, there's rubbing. Shoes are rubbing against the soles of your feet. Although, let's be honest, lately, I have not had a lot of abrasion on my feet. I'm living the barefoot life over here. It's kind of nice. So my thick skin is not getting put to good use over here. But areas that normally have high abrasion, palms of your hands, soles of your feet, we're going to have thick skin. To help us, I'm going to delete my words here. To help us identify those strata, I'm going to start with some brackets here. Okay, so there's one stratum. We're going to make a little line, another little line, little bracket, and a line. I know that you guys can help me out with this. The very bottom layer, the lowest stratum in the epidermis, what was the name of the lowest layer in the epidermis? What's that lowest layer called? Yeah, stratum basal. That's the one in the basement at the very bottom. So stratum basal is my very lowest layer of the skin. I drew a line over to the model too. One layer of cells, the cells that are doing mitosis. They're constantly growing. Right on top of stratum basal, we had that really big living layer. What was the name of the layer right on top of stratum basal? Which one lived on top of that? Yeah, Hannah got it for us. Stratum spinosum. Stratum spinosum, again, is that largest living layer. So all of these cells mixed inside of here in stratum spinosum, we can see all of them over here. These cells are all alive. They're doing great. Once we get to this dark layer, though, this is when those cells start to die. So I can see it's not quite as pronounced here, but see how some of these cells are a little bit darker that I see right here? So those darker cells are the ones that are in that layer that we called stratum granulosum. Stratum granulosum, where we've got those granules that makes things dark. So stratum granulosum is that darker layer of cells. We saw those when we were looking at our thin skin. Now here's where we hit a new layer, a layer of cells that is only seen in thick skin. See this really light line right here? And if I look over at my slide over here, see I've got this light line right here. This light line right here is actually cells. It's not an open space. There are cells there. And those cells are found in what we call stratum lucidum. Stratum lucidum. And that word lucidum means clear. So stratum lucidum is a clear layer of cells that's found right on top of that dark purple layer of cells, stratum granulosum. So right on top of stratum granulosum is stratum lucidum. That's this line that I see right here, stratum lucidum, the clear cells. And I know you guys can help me out with this one. What's that outermost layer of the skin called? That outermost one where the cells are filled with keratin. Stratum, anybody remember? Yeah, stratum corneum on the outside. Stratum corneum. So all this stuff out here, stratum corneum, and it's all the stuff that I see in here. Yeah, so Jacqueline asked a good question. We won't see that gray line layer in thin skin. That's correct. You will not see this specific layer of cells when we're doing thin skin. What we see on thin skin sometimes is you'll see an open space where the cells fell apart. They're not there anymore. But that's not stratum lucidum. Stratum lucidum is when there's actually cells there. And these cells look clear because they're starting to fill with keratin. By the time they hit stratum corneum, they look dark in appearance again because all of the liquid that's inside of them has essentially kind of evaporated out, and now they're really flat and they're really dark looking. So we would not see stratum lucidum. We wouldn't see this light line that we see right here when we're talking about thin skin. Hey, by the way, here's a fun statement to help you remember the order of things. Come, let's get sunburned. I can't claim this because I saw it online. Come, let's get sunburned. Stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and Stratum Basal. So there's a statement for you to help you remember the order that those strata go in. I wouldn't recommend getting sunburned, but if it helps you to remember where to find those layers, go for it. How do we feel about the strata of the epidermis? Thumbs up, questions? What are we thinking? One of us has a thumbs up. Getting a few more. Here's your daily emoji penguin. I'll try to remember to draw one later. How many of you guys were here yesterday? My penguin yesterday was on point. He looked good, the first one. The second one didn't look so good. But that first one yesterday, he was awesome. Nice. Hannah says she took a picture. Yeah, he was legit. Have to see if I can match him again someday. I like to draw them with little igloos, by the way. My daughter likes it when I draw her penguin cartoons. So sometimes I draw them little igloo homes. Okay, let me bump here. What I'm going to say is I'm not going to take a ton of class time to go through and label all of the structures that you're supposed to label in the dermis. There's a lot of different, we call them accessory structures of the dermis that you're supposed to label. You've got this large picture that shows us all the layers of the skin together. And then you've got some smaller pictures that show different types of skin in different places. I will label a couple of things with you just to give you some ideas. Yeah, so Nicole's asking about tactile corpuscles. We can talk about that. So we'll talk about a few of these things and I'll give you a few of their functions. But the guided lesson talks more in depth about these different things. So I'm going to use this picture. Now see these black lines here? These black lines show you that in your lab packet, this one picture is separated into 3 different parts. So the black lines show you where things are separated. So what you would see labeled in your lab packet, the middle section here says it's axillary skin. So with a D again, axillary skin is what that picture is labeled. The one over here on the right is labeled thick skin. And the one on the left is labeled thin skin, I believe. So you've got 3 different pictures in your packet. Yeah, so Jacqueline beat me to it. This axillary skin, this is the type of skin found in your armpit. The axillary region was the armpit region. One of my previous students said the way she liked to remember that is, yeah, Axe body spray. Jacqueline, you are on fire today. Man, I think you should just teach the class. I'll turn it over to you now. No, you're good. So axillary skin, axillary region, armpit region. Here's the reason that we're pointing out that this is axillary skin. This big thing right here, circle it, big thing right here. This is called an apocrine gland. Apocrine gland. This apocrine gland, I like to call these the body odor glands, the BO glands. Apocrine glands are only found in places like the axillary skin where they make sweat that smells bad. So the way that works is you make some sweat that has some oil and it has some proteins in it. You spit that out onto your skin and the bacteria that's on your skin says, sweet, you're feeding me. And it eats that protein and eats that fat and makes body odor. So this really big gland that we see here in the middle in the axillary skin, that's called an apocrine gland. And apocrine glands make the smelly sweat that your body makes. We also have, though, I'm going to try to circle it, and we can see it in multiple places. See that the little white one that I tried to circle? I'm going to circle it again over in thin skin too, because it's the same thing. We can see that gland that's white. My tip off with this white gland, notice it goes all the way to the surface of the skin up here. So this type of gland is called an Acron gland, an Acron gland. Acron glands, these white glands here, these make the watery sweat that cools you off. So we have a word for the type of sweat that cools you off. I'm going to type it for you. It's called thermoregulatory. Thermoregulatory sweat, so it regulates your temperature. Acron glands here, they make watery sweat that helps you to cool off. Apocrine glands make sweat that makes you smelly. And then there's one other major type of gland for you to be familiar with, and that's these ones right here. So let me circle it. And you can see it again over here attached to the hair. When we talk about the type of glands that are attached to hairs, those ones are called sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands. The way to recognize a sebaceous gland is that it's attached to a hair. Sebaceous glands make something called sebum. Does anyone happen to know the normal person word for sebum? Sebum? Any guesses? I say it and I'm thinking this. Here, I'll put it in the type. Sebum. And I'm like, yes, please. I would love to be a sebum. Yeah, so it's related to acne. Absolutely. The stuff that sebaceous glands make is sebum, which is a fancy word for oil. I give up. I'm just going home, apparently. Actually, I'm at home. That's so sad. Okay, sebum is the fancy word for oil. Sebaceous glands are my oil-making glands. They are always attached to hairs. Now, when a sebaceous gland goes nuts and it makes too much oil, we get oily skin. And if that sebum happens to get trapped inside the skin, if we're not able to excrete it onto the surface of the skin, that's when we start to see acne. So those things called whiteheads that everyone loves, right? Whiteheads are when we get all this sebum that's caught up here inside the gland. It can't get onto the surface. That's what happens in acne. So sebaceous glands attach to the hair. Acron glands, they go all the way to the surface of the skin. Apocrine glands also go to the surface of the skin, but they're much larger. So apocrine glands much larger. I know we had a question in the chat about things called tactile corpuscles, and there's one other kind of corpuscle. I am going to erase my slide so I have a little more space to write. So this will come back in the video if you didn't quite catch everything, but let me clear it off. When we talk about corpuscles, let me type that word along the bottom. Corpuscle. Whenever you see the word corpuscle, you're thinking nervous system. So these are the types of nervous system structures that we have in the skin. The first kind of corpuscle that we will identify is called the lamellar corpuscle. Lamellar, or sometimes you'll see it called lamellated corpuscle. The lamellar corpuscle is this thing you see down here at the bottom of my thick skin. Lamellar corpuscles always found very deep in the skin. They're found down in the hypodermis layer. By the way, I'll mention the way we know we're in the hypodermis here is the type of tissue that I see. What is this yellow stuff representing right here? What kind of tissue is this yellow stuff? What's in the hypodermis? Yeah, adipose. So we're surrounded by adipose down here. That means we're down here in the hypodermis layer. So lamellar corpuscles are really deep in the skin. Lamellar corpuscles help us to detect pressure. The best way I like to remember pressure is think about picking up a heavy bowling ball. When you're holding it in your hand, it presses down on you. For us to be able to detect pressure, it's got to be really heavy because my pressure detector is down here. My lamellar corpuscle is down really deep. So lamellar corpuscles deep in the hypodermis, they detect pressure. Tactile corpuscles, that's my other structure. Tactile corpuscles, spelled it wrong, sorry. Tactile corpuscles are these little guys that are right up here. We're finding them up here in the papillary region of the dermis. Tactile corpuscles help us with touch sensations, so we call it light touch. So tactile corpuscles help you, for example, if you're reading Braille or you're feeling the texture of something. Light touch with tactile corpuscles. So they're found, I'll circle them up here, you can see up inside the little dermal papillae. That's where I find those tactile corpuscles. So 2 different kinds of nervous tissue structures. They detect different things because they're found in different places. How do we feel about our accessory structures? I know I didn't cover everything, but how do we feel generally about those guys? We feel tired, right? The good thing about cloudy weather is it's great for taking naps. The bad thing is I have 2 children that don't nap. So alas, no napping for me. Okay, well, I'll mention a few other structures that you still have to label on these pictures. You are also supposed to label those regions of the skin on the pictures. So use what we talked about to help you figure out where the different regions, the epidermis, the papillary and reticular dermis, etc. Use that to help you when you're labeling these pictures. I want to briefly talk to you about the different types of burns that we have in the body. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about acne, and then we're going to do just a quick group work thing to make sure that some stuff has sunk in. So one of the disorders you can have with your skin is burns, and burns are labeled 1st degree, 2nd degree, 3rd degree. It's all about how many of those layers, or we maybe could say those regions of the skin that we've burned. So a 1st degree burn, how many, not a trick question, how many layers of the skin do you think we've burned in a 1st degree burn? 1st degree. Yeah, we just burned 1 layer of the skin. So 1st degree burn, we burn the outermost layer of the skin. This is the kind of burn that looks kind of rosy. It's warm to the touch. We only damage the epidermis in a 1st degree burn. When we have a 2nd degree burn, we've now gone down into that upper part of the dermis, into the papillary layer of the dermis. The way you'll recognize a 2nd degree burn, always 100% of the time, you're going to see blisters. So they're not fun to look at, but every time you see blisters, that's a 2nd degree burn. 3rd degree burns are sometimes called a full thickness burn, meaning we go all the way through the epidermis, all the way through the parts of the dermis, possibly all the way down into the hypodermis. So we're at least going to get down into what's called the reticular layer of the dermis, if not all the way down into the hypodermis. That's a 3rd degree burn. So when you see a 3rd degree burn, we completely damage up everything in the skin. So you've got a picture of models in your lab packet. Hey, we can do this together since there's just a few of us here. Up above the pictures, you guys see the little T up above where I'm pointing? Go ahead and click on that T. Help me fill in. We want to label, are these 1st degree, 2nd degree, or 3rd degree burns? So click on that little T up there, and that'll let you type on my slide. I want us to type what degree burns are we looking at on each of these models. Awesome, good. We're typing those in. So our big tip off with this one, right, is that blister, that ugly fluid-filled space. Hey, fun fact about blisters, the reason we get this fluid-filled space here is the epidermis literally separates from the dermis. So when the epidermis pulls away from the dermis layer. Some of that, here, let's do a lecture review here. Some of the interstitial fluid that I find in the dermis, in between the cells of the dermis, collects in this space between the epidermis and the dermis. So a blister is actually filled with interstitial fluid, the stuff that leaked out of these tissues down here. So second degree burn always has blisters every single time. Yeah, Jacqueline asked a first degree burn. Would we consider that a sunburn? Yes, that's the most common first degree burn. So we just damaged our cells that live here in the outermost layer of the skin. And here's a reminder, the name of those cells are called keratinocytes. So we damaged our keratinocytes, the cells that live out here in the epidermis, but we didn't damage the place where the epidermis meets the dermis. That's why we don't have a blister. If our damage goes all the way down to where they meet, then we're gonna have issues. We're gonna make that blister. And if I go all the way down, if I damage, but usually with a third degree burn, the epidermis is completely gone. So there's none of that keratinized stratified squamous epithelium left. We usually mess up that junction between the epidermis and the dermis, and then we go down deep into the dermis to really mess things up. Hey, third degree burns, when they first happen, most of the time, the site of the third degree burn is painless. It doesn't hurt at the site of the third degree burn. Any guesses why at the site of a third degree burn, it doesn't hurt? Yeah, exactly right. In a third degree burn, we've damaged the nervous tissue. We've destroyed, actually, the nervous tissue that lives in the skin that would detect the pain sensation. Now, to be fair, when it happens, the site of the third degree burn doesn't hurt. But when we start trying to heal the site of the third degree burn, you better believe that's going to hurt, and it's going to hurt like crazy, because we literally have to build new nervous system tissue to help us detect things there. So a third degree burn damages all of the nervous tissue that was present in the skin. So we don't feel that burn at first, but as it starts trying to heal itself, it's definitely going to hurt. So burns, the first example of damage we can do to the skin or disorders of the skin. The other example of a disorder of the skin is everyone's favorite, which is acne. Everyone's favorite is acne. So check it out. I see a little whitehead here. This is something that we talked about. This stuff that I see inside this area of the skin, I made a whole bunch of it and it can't get out. Does anyone remember what this was here? Yeah, this was that oil. What was our fancy word for it? Did anyone write it down? Fancy word for that stuff. Yep, it's the sebum. I want to go be a sebum. It's the sebum. This is all oil. It's all stuck inside here. So I've got a whole bunch of oil, a whole bunch of sebum. Sebum that's made by sebaceous glands, and I can't get it onto the surface of the skin. So acne is when we've got a whole bunch of sebum that gets caught up inside the skin and I can't release it. That's what happens in acne. All right, that is all of the week 5 lab. What I had planned for us here at the very end is I've pulled a couple more slides to give us some practice labeling the regions of the skin and labeling the strata. So what I will probably do is I'll turn off the recording and then post those slides up for us, and we'll just kind of work together to get those things labeled just as a review. But that's all I've got planned for today. Any last minute questions before I turn off that recording, and then we just kind of work together? Okay, well, I'm not seeing any questions. So for my friends on the recording, Good luck on this assignment. Hope to see you in class sometime soon.